Welcome everyone to the Co-Creators Convergence Thursday Creator Convo. I'm Noelle Marshall, and I'm so delighted with our super host Gina Mazza here tonight, bringing us another super guest, Dr. Joe Weston, who this is the first time we've met, and I'm very excited. He has a new book out, Fear Civility. It's just something we so need at this time, so it's timely, and we're going to learn more about it. And before we begin, I'm just going to ask everyone, you can just turn off your video, you can mute yourself, just relax, but we will have conversation, and throughout you can put your comments and questions in the chat. And so if he's talking about something, you can put your question there. We'll go back to all the questions, and you can put comments too, like, he's the greatest speaker you've ever had, something like that. That works too. So also, you might want to silence your cell phone, but before you do, you might say, oh, I'm going to share this to some other people, because there's a lot more room to hear this wonderful talk tonight. So without any further ado or advertising, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Co-Creators Convergence. So please stand by. So that is a little bit about the Co-Creators Convergence and the guests that we have coming up. So before I turn it over, I want to tell you a little bit about Gina Mazza. And she is a dear friend and someone who took me to Damanhur, Italy for the first time to visit an eco-spiritual community there. So we're so grateful. But let me tell you a little bit about this word provocateur and creative alchemist that she is. As a writing coach, creative muse, book editor, communications pro, and publishing consultant, Gina has helped hundreds of individuals refine their writing projects and send them off into the world so they can share their gift to the shift in humanity. She is also a poet and the author of 3 of her own books, including in the personal growth category, Everything Matters, Nothing Matters. In addition to her core talent in writing and publishing, Gina also has a solid background in entrepreneurship, PR, business marketing, media writing, corporate branding, and the use of intuitive guidance to elucidate one's work, mission, purpose, and passion. And you can find out more about Gina at ginamazza.com. So that's a little bit. But basically, she's one of my BFFs, also located in Tennessee. Wow, did either of us think we'd end up in Tennessee? So, kind of never knew that was coming. So before we begin, I just want to thank everyone for coming. And I want to just bring us into a centering now. I just invite you to come into the present moment. We're going to have a wonderful 90 minutes of wisdom and conversation. So I just invite you to take 3 deep breaths. In through the nose, out through the mouth. And I just invite you to be here now. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our super host, Gina, who is going to introduce us to our guest of honor, Joe Weston. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, you are one of my BFFs, and it was so cool to spend time in Dominar with you. And I just want to start out, as always, by giving you some love, you and Bob, who isn't here tonight, but is here in spirit, I'm sure. And just so appreciate so much that the both of you do to carry the mantle of CCC and the legacy of Barbara Marx Hubbard. And you make it look so easy. And I know it's not. I know that there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. And so I just want to say that we appreciate you, and we sure do love you. So now it is definitely my delight and my honor to introduce Joe Weston. Some of you may know him here, some of you may not. But I'm going to give you the roll call here of Joe's illustrious life experience here. He is an international trainer, author, lecturer, consultant, professor, coach, and as we're going to talk about tonight, an advocate for lasting peace. And his career spans more than 3 decades in the fields of conflict prevention, leadership, stress management, and communication. He's a highly sought after facilitator for individuals as well as corporations, government agencies, and nonprofits around the world. And so just really honored that you're taking time with us here tonight, Joe. Joe has lived overseas in Amsterdam for a couple of decades and has worked and traveled in different parts of the world. And as he was in these different locales, he studied and practiced many, many contemplative practices, as well as learned about neuroscience and various communication models, and developed really a unique approach, which is the basis of civility, that combines not just skills and other types of tools, but also contemplative practices and really practical stuff that anyone can do at any time. So Joe is the founder of the Weston Network, and his international team provides trainings, consulting, and coaching based on a methodology that he calls respectful confrontation. And you can find out a lot more about that at joeweston.com. And in 2020, this is something really important for us all here to know as well, he founded what's called the Civility Project. And this is a nonprofit that further carries out the work that he does, but it's so cool because it offers a lot of ways for anyone to just step in and start engaging with things to do in this larger community that he has created. So I definitely encourage you, again, you can go to joeweston.com and find out more about the Civility Project. Joe has served as an adjunct professor in Georgetown University's Department of Government program of conflict resolution. I don't know why I'm having a problem saying conflict resolution tonight. His work with women's rights and other humanitarian organizations in the Middle East and the US focus on empowerment and leadership. He has worked with various veterans organizations in processes of integration and healing, and has volunteered for the Liberation Prison Project, teaching meditation and leadership to inmates. And there's a really cool story in the Civility book about his interaction with the inmates on one of those engagements that he had. And last but not least, he is the author of 2 books, Mastering Respectful Confrontation, A Guide to Personal Freedom and Empowered Collaborative Engagement, and Civility. Now I'm going to forget the subtitle, which I should know.
Can I say it?
Yes, go ahead.
Transforming our global culture from polarization to lasting peace.
And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So Welcome, Joe, and everybody, please meet Joe Weston.
Thank you, Gina. Wow, that's a lot. You exhausted me from all the things I've done. So just hearing all the things I've done. So that's nice to hear, though. And it's nice to be reflected back to see myself and feel myself through you, your heart and your eyes. So I appreciate that. And I would like to say that I know that I am a blessed man. And I truly believe that because you have wandered into my life and all the gifts that you've given me. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for that reflection.
And
Appreciate it.
I'm sure I'm not the only one who says that.
Well, tonight we're going to be talking about this thing called reuniting our human story of fierce hope. And hopefully we will have time to cover not just why it's necessary to even do this at this inflection point in our human culture, but more crucially, how to do it. I think that's where a lot of us get hung up, and how to do it in a pragmatic, effective way. The goal, of course, being the co-creation, we'll use that word, the co-creation of real solutions to problems that we've gotten ourselves into. I think that that's really, we have ourselves to blame for some of these issues that we're facing now in our world. But before we get into that, Joe, just for context, I would love for you to start us out just by sharing a little bit about, whatever you're willing to share about your impetus for making conflict resolution and lasting peace your life's work. I know from our time writing together that this started with you from a very young age when you were a little kid growing up in Queens, New York. So can you share a little bit about how this all started for you?
Sure, thank you. Yeah. And a lot of people ask me, why are you so attracted to conflict and confrontation and all of this and friction and all of that? And I mean, one answer is because that's where I think the solutions lie. That is the process of creative emergence. It's friction. It's a messy process, and I find that a lot of us talk about it, but that we haven't trained ourselves to be in that level of messy when the stakes are high, to be able to hold that, still stay in our hearts, and transform that, alchemize that into solutions that don't even exist yet. And that is the essence of the work I do. I've heard individuals and couples and organizations say that when they've used the tools that I offer, that they say in the past where there were no solutions, suddenly new solutions emerge. And I think a lot of people, we're talking about that. We're in this unique time. And I've been saying this now for a number of years that, well, I'll get to my story, but I just want to give that context that already now for more than 15, 20 years, I would start every lecture or workshop with, the bad news is everything that we know, all the systems we know, they're crumbling. And the good news is that all the systems as we know, they're crumbling. And it's an exciting moment. And as you all probably know, that's the liminal space where miracles can happen. And we're in that. And I say we're training ourselves, or I would like to believe I'm training myself and those who I'm working with to be midwives for a system that's dying, death doulas, you could say, and midwives for a system that's being birthed. And I've worked with doulas. They've asked me to come and train them in respectful confrontation. And let me tell you, if you've never met anybody who's embodied fierce compassion like they do, it's remarkable how fierce they are, how compassionate they are. And with that level of presence and that level of capacity to be in it without being caught up in the emotionality of it, to have effective decision-making, to be loving and nurturing and at the same time sharp and fierce, that is what I feel more of us could step into to be of service in this transition that we're now currently seeing. And it's exciting. It also comes with my martial arts background. That's an important part of the work I do. To understand that a true martial artist, the more that they learn how to fight, the less you end up fighting. And that's also an important skill. And we can talk more about that. But where did this conflict and confrontation come from? Growing up in New York City, I say that just being in New York City every day was an examination of conflict and confrontation. Just navigating what I call intimacy among strangers, just the constant having to negotiate space and with millions of people basically, and still be able to function and do that in a way that's effective. And what I love about New York is that there's a lot of emotion, and you know what you're getting. So I learned a lot with that, but I also grew up in a pretty volatile family situation, which included my dad being in jail when I was around 12 years old. And many other challenging situations in that, where I had to really learn how to survive in a way and understand the dynamics of conflict and confrontation. And yet there was always a part of me that, even though I had to fight to basically find my way and as a young boy in Queens, my father was a boxer, so he was a fighter, and that really was like the dynamic. I still always felt that it was silly and unproductive. And one of the fundamental questions that I had, even as a boy, which is basically the through line for all of my work, basically what's the quest for me, is why is it, even though we know better, even though we're a relatively intelligent species, I would say, we can see close-up pictures of Pluto. Now, we can see into the smallest of atoms. Technologically, we're pretty advanced. We have all the information we need at our fingertips. Why isn't it that even though we know better, we still have arguments and fights? And on a larger scale, crime and war and hunger and oppression. And I find that most people would just say that that's just the way we are. And that's an accurate answer, but I was never satisfied with that answer. I wanted to get to the root cause of it. And that has been my life passion, which is to understand what are the causes that, even though we know better, and even if we maybe want it to be different, we still get caught in those patterns. So that was the impetus of my young adult life. Luckily, someone introduced me to Tai Chi, and that was an important part of my development in many ways, just cultivating mind-body relationship, understanding the energy systems of the body, understanding how to yield to energy without being weak, that yielding to energy and flowing is not necessarily weakness and submission, and that there's power in it, enormous power in it. And all of that helped me to develop that. Then I ended up in the Netherlands, where I started doing communication trainings, specifically with dealing with aggression. You can imagine, I'm going to date myself a little bit, but the first trainings I did was for KLM, the airline there, in 1991, I believe it was, in dealing with aggression. So you can imagine, even then they were already tracking that customers and were getting more aggressive. And if you just look at where we are now, so just tracking that. And I've always had a passion for peace. I've always had a passion that comes from not only the Taoist training that I have and studying Taoism and Taoist alchemy, but also practicing almost 30 years in Tibetan Buddhism, where I met my teacher in the Netherlands, Geshe Sonam Gyaltsen, in 1994. And my very first training was in Lojong, which is compassion training, cultivating the bodhicitta, the compassionate heart. And that has transformed me in so many ways, and understanding the true nature of reality, the true nature of suffering, and rewiring my system to be of service, to alleviate the suffering of others, and to bring about the happiness of others. If I can go on, the evolution of this is in 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq. That made me literally physically sick. I was in bed for 2 days, and I had a wonderful life in the Netherlands, but I suddenly thought to myself, I think I have to go back to the US, because the US could use some loving. So in 2005, I did come back to the US. I was in the Bay Area, where I was doing various work, and that's where I started in transformational healing work, and I studied to be a body worker as well, and conscious breathing facilitator, and put that all together with all of the practices I've done to create respectful confrontation, which I started doing in 2005. And was doing that for individuals, because there were two fundamental things of what made me want to do respectful confrontation. the first was that I had encountered so many people around the world who had so many gifts and talents and wisdom and passion, but couldn't find the power within themselves to manifest it. And I thought, if I can offer a training of some way that could help people overcome what their obstacles were, then I've done my job in a sense, because then they could share their gifts and expand their scope of influence. And the other reason is that I have already been involved with a number of Dharma centers and spiritual communities and peace activist communities and conflict resolution communities. And what I found is that when everybody was doing the work or in the meditation hall, everyone's hearts were open and everyone was resonant in the higher values of love and compassion. But as soon as people got into their cars, they started getting right back into their behavior of cursing people in the car, or if it came down to who was going to do the mailing or clean the toilets, it got into really ugly discussions, a lot of unconscious harm. And that also was for me, there's something there that needs to be connected. So, and eventually I ended up in Washington, D.C., where I currently am. I've been here now, I can't believe it, for 11 years, on the lands that have been beautifully stewarded by the Piscataway tribes. And I'm very grateful to be able to be and to inhabit that. And been doing work internationally. You mentioned a lot of the work I've been doing a lot of social justice work, racial justice work, gender justice work. And if we have time, I can tell you more about the various groups I've worked with in the Middle East with women's rights organizations. But that's the whole story. And it really has to do with what does it take to support people, to facilitate people in their own process of alchemizing and activating within them their best selves, their most empowered selves. Not that I am already there. I do not see that at all. But that to me is when I get the opportunity to do that, I am most happy.
You know, what strikes me, Joe, is that it's such a big soul mission. I mean, it's such a magnanimous calling that you've had. And the way that you speak about it is that, you know, one thing led to another, to another, to another, which is what happens when you are on your path, right? But I'm sure that there have been times when you've maybe doubted that, or, you know, we're talking tonight about hope. So were there times when you almost lost hope in what you were doing or the mission of what you're called to do? Because it seems so insurmountable at times that I think this is something that a lot of us struggle with is it even possible to have lasting peace? And you've lived that reality for all these decades. So have you ever gotten to the point where you say it's just not possible?
I don't think I've ever said it's not possible. So what I do say is that I may not be very optimistic about where we're at and what's happening, and I have hope. And I can distinguish that. I don't use words like positive and good and optimistic. Not that they're bad, but to me that I try to avoid words that get caught in the polarity of good, bad, and things like that, and words that and that's a big part of the work, is to be able to distinguish very clearly in every moment the difference between a judgment and an assessment. But that's getting into a very specific detail. But I would say, you know, because I am realistic, I'm very practical in that way. And what is happening is really painful and worrisome on this planet. So I'm not optimistic. I think that, and I'm realistic in the fact that there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of violence. It may continue. So on that level, I'm not optimistic. And I do believe that what emerges from all of it, I have hope, it is going to be an evolution or an evolved way of being on this planet, a higher resonance. And I'm talking to people who already believe this, I would think. So I don't think I'm saying anything strange. But I do believe that to me is, and I have certainly have lost, at moments, lost faith in my own capacity, and that's something that I'm always working on. And I see that as my alchemical process and my growth process. But I would say that for me, what a large portion of this work is to understand the importance of being in the uncomfortable. And that is alchemy. Alchemy is an uncomfortable process. If you think of that poor piece of lead, what it goes through, that poor piece of lead goes through a lot to get to being a piece of gold. And, you know, if it had feelings, if it was sentient, and you might say what it is, it's gotta hurt. And you know, there's a wonderful Rumi story that I'll say briefly of the carpet sweeper. I'm not sure exactly. It's a beautiful. I'm not Rumi, so I can't say it the way he says it. But the essence of the story is that it's when you beat the carpets to clean them, and at a certain point, the carpet bursts into tears and says to the one who's beating, says, "Why are you beating? Why are you hurting me?" And he says, "Oh, I'm so sorry that it's causing you pain, but just know what I'm doing is I'm shaking off all of the dross and the dust so that your beauty can shine through." So for me, people who know me know that I don't seek out the uncomfortable, but I do find that when the uncomfortable shows up, it's not about avoiding the uncomfortable, which I find a lot of people are doing, which is on some level, I would believe, contributing to the problem that we're facing. It's about learning how to be skillful in the uncomfortable, how to manage that, how to manage regulating your nervous system in the uncomfortable, how to still maintain your balance and your stability and your centeredness and your grounding, to still check in that moment. How safe am I feeling in this moment? And one of the important pivots, which I'm sure we'll talk about the power of the pivot in the book, is understanding that being uncomfortable is not necessarily the same thing as being unsafe. And that we can learn to cultivate more of a sense of being in relationship with our nervous system, to be able to sense when we are uncomfortable and to check if we are safe, then we know we're on the right path to something new emerging. And it's only in that uncomfortable where something new emerges. So the more we can tap into this level of I am safe, because for me, there's a direct correlation between how safe you are and how open your heart is. And I can say more, but it's perhaps it's an opportunity for you to share something. We can get.
Yeah, I hope that we get into all of these aspects, because I think it's really important to address how, again, the how, like what are the steps that we take? What are the first things that we need to know how to do for ourselves in order to, you know, even have the courage to step forward into a bigger sphere in our community or in our country, in the world, whatever, and do the work that we feel called to do. But first, it's, you know, it starts with the self, right? It starts with us feeling, like you said, safe and having our systems regulated so that we are in our power, so to speak, in our, you know, in the best shape possible for stepping forward and bringing our gifts in and doing what we need to do, right?
Yes, yes, I see it the same way. I would say, and that's a fundamental principle, which is it's in your vulnerability that your true power is revealed. And I've been doing that in spiritual circles, teaching that. And then the work is that it just isn't an idea. The work is then to understand that more in your heart and then feel it in your body. And that to understand that what it feels in your body to step into vulnerability and to notice how much of your authenticity, how much of your power, unlimited power can flow through you. Where you become unstoppable. And I've done this in every workshop, whether it's with CEOs, whether it's at NASA, whether it's with incarcerated men in conflict zones. I've done this and that is the framework work of respectful confrontation and fierce civility, is to give people an experience where they are present in the moment. They're safe, and the most important thing, they get to choose how deeply they step into their vulnerability. So in a sense, right away, you're teaching people what it's like to set boundaries and to know that they can stretch as much as they want into that. And with each step that they invest in opening up more, they get to literally feel an embodied sense of power within them.
Yeah, so I want to get more into that, but first let me back up just real quickly because I want to give a context for all of the stuff that you just described that you've been doing in your work. It's brought you to this point where you developed this blueprint that you call the Fear, Civility 6-step pathway of hope. And as you say it in the book, it's a pathway for those who feel called to usher in a renewed approach to civic engagement that transcends outworn structures, as you spoke about, structures of separation, labels, and performative displays of civility in our families, workplaces, communities, and countries. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Why is the way that we engage with each other no longer working? What are we missing?
Well, I wonder if it ever worked. I mean, and I think it worked for a while from an old-fashioned definition of civility. You know, like a lot of people say, I talk with a lot of communities, particularly a lot of social justice organizations and advocates who say that the time for civility is over, you know, to meet our times. And I think that's unfortunate because I say you can't confront a bully by becoming a bully, because in a sense, basically the bully system has just pulled you into becoming one of them. You can't fight a system. By fighting the system, you actually strengthen that system. So it's about finding a new way, and that's why this idea of both the fierceness and the civility that they can come together. I think this is a key point in terms of understanding that one of the fundamental things that I say often is that if only hanging out with people who already agree with you were going to solve our world problems, we would have already solved our world problems. So in essence, if that's the case, then what we need to step into is to be able to engage with people who hold different views and that are different. And that to me is the solution. And I think what we're seeing is that, and we can spend hours talking about what the causes might be, but we're seeing an increased ongoing breakdown of civic engagement, civil discourse, personal agency, and independent critical thinking. And those things, have been exacerbated in the last 20 to 30 years, you could say, which is basically shutting us down and causing this extreme polarization where we can no longer see individuals, we only see labels, we only see groups, political groups or systems. And in a sense, I've been involved with a lot of think tanks around the US and in various parts of the world, and people come up with these brilliant ideas spend a lot of money to do research, to come up with ideas to solve our world problems. But I always say that those aren't going to work until we address two important factors, is that as long as we are in a certain level of dysregulation, of trauma, with the pandemic, with what's been going on the last 20, 30 years, maybe more, what we're seeing now, with climate change, climate migration, poor Mother Earth going through what she's going through and how people are struggling with that, economic instability, political instability, and the media system that wants to keep us dysregulated because in a sense, they profit from that and the world system as a whole profits from that. We're all in some sort of trauma response, personally, culturally, generationally. And as long as we're in that trauma response, basic neuroscience, if you're in that response, then anything that is different or new, you're going to perceive as a threat, and maybe even a threat to your life, which means that we are no longer able or wired to open to new ideas. It, for many people, is almost a life or death experience to think about shifting a viewpoint. It wasn't always like that. It was on certain level, but it's gotten more extreme. When you're in that state of fight, flight, freeze, when you're basically in survival response, you certainly don't have your heart open. And if your heart is not open, then that means you're not tapping into your humanity and your highest gifts, and it also means you're not seeing the humanity of the other. So it makes it easier to distance yourself. And even with the best intentions, the people who say that they have spiritual practices and have high regard, I wonder what their thoughts, even though they don't act do harmful things, what's going on in their thoughts and their speech, that's still creating more separation. And I would say that is what we're seeing right now, is that to get to the root cause of it, that until we address that, any solution that emerges that could solve a lot of our problems most likely would not take root and grow.
Yeah, and I love what you said about if you only hang out with people who agree with you, then the solutions aren't going to be apparent, right? I even think of terms that we use like-minded, like I like hanging out with like-minded people. Well, if we're hanging out with like-minded people, that means nobody's disagreeing with you. So that means you're sort of inside your own echo chamber, right? But
Yeah.
you do talk in the book about expanding this concept of your neighbor, and I don't know if we want to get into that aspect, but I think that's important too, to look at.
But what I would say about that, Gina, we've talked about that, the image that I have of, let's just imagine for a moment that's the key or the coding or the solution to help us evolve to our highest self, not only as individuals, but as a human family. What if it's like a puzzle? What if it's like it's already there, and somehow the puzzle or the solution got broken up into little puzzle pieces, and that it's become fragmented, and that every different group of people around the planet are holding on to one piece of that puzzle. And why do I say that? Because every different group around the planet, and that in a sense, what they're holding on to is important information for all of us. And because we're not communicating with each other, in fact, we're warring with each other, and we think we're separate, we're not bringing our pieces of the puzzle to the table. And if we could all come to the table with our pieces of the puzzle, we can put it together and see the richness and see the blueprint for lasting peace, right? All the systems we've created now were created by human beings. They did not exist 10,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago. They basically only exist because human beings made a bunch of agreements with each other for them to exist. It's the only reason why they exist, which means two things. They need us they're dependent on us, those systems. And at the same time, if human beings created them, then human beings can change them. And we need to get back to remembering our own personal agency in that. The system is now so strong that it's done a good job of keeping us from seeing that. And the solutions are, we each have a different piece of the puzzle, and we have to come together, put those pieces of the puzzles together, and recognize that the solutions that we come up with have to be more diverse. They have to be inclusive. They have to come from different viewpoints and perspectives to survive and to be resilient and sustainable, and to get more buy-in so that they have the opportunity to grow.
Yeah, and so again, we're talking about how do we do that? How do we get from here to there? And I'd love to jump ahead to book part 2, where you talk about skills building, because it really does seem that we wouldn't go on any quest. We wouldn't trek up Mount Everest without some skills and some tools. And so let's talk about those a little bit. I love, I love all of them, but the one that I really wanted to make sure that we touch upon is this what you call non-judgmental critical thinking, or unexamined, I think you call it unexamined assumptions from external factors. I think we're all sort of guilty of this, and we clearly have a breakdown in critical thinking. I mean, this is my opinion, but I feel like this is really what's happening in a big way right now. It's one of my biggest frustrations, especially working in the media. And don't get me started on all the ways that the news reports the news these days. You know, it's really not news, it's narrative, right? It's not really reportage like when I started my career, but anyway, people hear these sound bites and they sort of take at face value what they're hearing because it's coming from what was at least once a trusted source, and they stop there. They take it as fact or information or misinformation if they're told that it's misinformation. And I feel like to make it even more challenging, the spin is not just intentional, but it's kind of sly, right? To the point of being imperceptible. Like you really have to be paying attention. And even if you are paying attention, it's like, what do we believe and who do we trust? And I just feel like this has happened so much more since, you know, the COVID pandemic and people being online more. So let's talk a little bit about non-critical or non-judgmental critical thinking.
Let's talk about it. I'd love to talk about it. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that or anybody else. But so I want to just clarify that, you know, in the book, Fear Civility is based on a practice in a sense. It's training people. It's like an upgraded communication training. You know, I don't claim to have the answer. I want to just be clear about that there are people doing remarkable work around the planet that deserve to be celebrated. And what my hope is that if people were to engage with the Fear Civility method, that they would be able to see and with practices and contemplations that I offer, that they can upgrade their skills for the purpose of them being more effective with less time and effort, which I think is what we all need right now. I think the number one hottest commodity or most precious thing is time, even more than money. So anything we can do that can, and energy. So I just want, so in a sense, and that's an important part of the book, Gina, as you know, is that I make it very clear that Fear Civility is not about the what, it's also about the how. And that we get caught up in our conversations about what, about the issues, about our opinions. And we just think that that's going to work. We try over and over again to convince our cousins or our uncles or neighbors that they should see the world the way we see it, that we're right and they're wrong. And then we just go back and forth debating our ideas, which is the what. And it's not working. So the question isn't the what. Of course, you can have your viewpoints and believe that. The question is, how are you approaching it? And that's what we've forgotten. So this work is really about becoming more skillful in having the same viewpoints and want to advocate for the same things, but how are you approaching it that allows the other person to still feel safe, to meet them where they are, make sure they keep their nervous system regulated. In other words, creating a safe, a space of more safety and trust, and then slowly inviting them into the idea of shifting their viewpoints. And in the process, also considering that you may not know everything, that you may need to shift your viewpoints as well. And that's where the important practice of cultivating non-judgmental critical thinking is that many of us, because the pivot there is to understand that my truth does not equal the truth. And that even though we know that here, and if I'm sure people who are listening are saying, well, of course I know that what I believe to be true is a perception and that I can't know everything. Yet for some reason, when we get into heated discussions or just when we get activated a little bit, we go right back into this idea like, no, I know everything, I'm right. And there's no way that I can open up to that. I heard you say something once, and in that one time, I understood completely everything you said. Or I saw an image on the internet, or I read something quickly on the internet, and I already understand what they fully mean. And that's where we get into arguments and fights, when we don't consider that anything that we perceive, especially if we haven't investigated it for a while, 20 years, 30 years, anything that we perceive could never be the full story. And what that should do is activate a deeper level of curiosity. And what I call courageous self-reflection, that we have the courage to consider that we can't, unless we are an enlightened being. And if there are any enlightened beings listening at this time, thank you so much for being here with us and listening to my humble words and my humble view of things and Gina's humble view of things. But until we are enlightened beings, we're still human beings, which means even though there may be the truth, the Tao, the Dharma, God, the universe, whatever you might want to call it, our human perception is limited. And that's courageous self-reflection. And that opens up a certain level of power and vulnerability, a curiosity that activates something within yourself. It opens your heart in a way where other people will want to engage with you more in conversation because they won't have to be as defensive thinking you're trying to convince them of something. So that's already part of the work. It's an embodied practice. And I see this happen often in all the communities I've worked with. I have taken decades to train myself to create an energetic where people feel safe around me, people open up, and I can say challenging things and I find that they can receive it. They may not agree, or they may see it differently, or they may challenge, they may get activated, they may be resistance. Believe me, I've had some heavy energy come to me. But to me, in a facilitator of transformation, when someone is in resistance, when someone's activated, and the more resistance and activation they have, for me, it's a bow. And it's like, thank you for showing up in that way. And I see it as a tremendous, I'm tremendously grateful that they trust me enough to go to that place. And that's where magic happens. And that's where new solutions emerge. That's where healing happens. That's where reconciliation happens. That's where new alliances are created. And that is the blueprint and essence of a culture of lasting peace. When we can cultivate the moment to moment, moving through the world in this way of practicing open-heartedness and not an external show of open-heartedness, but literally the waves coming from your heart, that you become a refuge for safety and trust. That to me is where many of us are ready to do, are wired to do, are craving to do, is to be a refuge for more people that they can trust and that they can feel safe so that they can grow and develop. They can share their gifts. You got to take a breath there.
Love to take a breath there because that is so beautiful, and what a world it would be if we could all do that. You know,
we
so
can.
powerful.
We can. It's a choice. It's just a question of, are we willing to let go of old habits, viewpoints, habits, and patterns, and stretch into new ones?
And again, as a first step, you had mentioned a couple of times this pivot, this concept of the power of the pivot. And I think everyone listening, if they only have this one takeaway, this is in itself so powerful that it's something that we can use in moments when we feel stuck or paralyzed. And that seems to be happening a lot too right now. So can you share with us what you mean by the power of the pivot, or how to do this?
Yes, I can. So as you've already mentioned, one of the pivots in understanding a blueprint for lasting peace is understanding that cultural transformation has to start with personal transformation. Starts with the individual, it then moves into the relational, to creating alliances. Power within is the first step. Power with is the second step. The third step is power to. And that's how we can shift a power over system. Fighting a power over system is just going to, as I said, it's just going to strengthen it. But pivoting away from that to get to personal power, I bring that up because we can't eliminate external polarization if we're still walking around with our own internal polarization. And so the work is understanding what are the ways that we still hold on to a lot of false polarities. We set up false polarities that aren't accurate to the reality that we're in at that moment. And how is that manifesting externally? And or I've done that to train myself, is that if I'm feeling a tension in any moment, if I'm feeling distance or separation, if I'm feeling shut down with someone or someone else is shut down, somewhere a false polarity has been activated, which is creating what I call a stagnation. And it creates a stagnation, like you could say, of two rams who are ramming against each other, and they keep ramming and pushing and pushing. I'm right. No, I'm right. And on and on. I'm going to win. No, I'm going to win. And we see that play out, and all the energy and the money and the resources and the time and the talent that goes into this dynamic. It's a shame. It's creating a stagnation. So the idea is, how do you break out of that stagnation? Well, literally just pivot. Just a simple shift. I get that from the martial arts, particularly Aikido. That's that when you find that you're in an internal polarization or an external polarization, find the way to simply shift the perspective or yield a little bit, and that shakes it up and gets you back. It reorients you. It gets you back to yourself, gets you back to connection with the other. And that is key in the work. Every time you're in a challenging situation, every time you're in a creative process, to notice when you start getting stuck and just figure there's got to be a pivot somewhere. And again, that can be internal, that can be external.
And it's also, with the martial arts too, I think about balance. That's another big word that is important in the work that you teach. And one of the main imbalances that you talk about in the book in terms of our global system is that the difference between technological and spiritual nourishment. And you say that we're technologically overfed and spiritually malnourished. So this is another thing that we need to contend with, right? We're out of balance in terms of those aspects, and it's really impacting us in big ways.
Yes, that's the essence of the again, the systems as we have created them, we created them. And what we have chosen to create, whether we like it or not, whether it's good or bad, it is as it is our focus on the technological and not as much on the spiritual. It's certainly in the last 100 years, if not more, certainly in the last 50 years, from a world system, because at the same time, there is an emergence happening that the media doesn't pick up on, as you know, and as everybody here probably knows. But this idea that we're looking at the world system as a global heart, and the global heart is not well. And just like in heart health, just like a doctor would say, if someone has it's interesting, in having lived in the Netherlands, I speak Dutch, and what I find interesting, the parallel with that the Dutch word for heart attack is stilstand. Still stand still, which I find interesting. And in a sense, that comes like the heart is not pumping in a healthy way. And so the global heart is not well. And it's because we're technologically overfed, fed, and spiritually malnourished. Just like a heart doctor would say, you eat too much fatty foods and not enough vegetables. So the simple remedy is to just bring that into balance, have a balanced diet of both technological, and this is where you avoid a pivot, right? It's not that either technological or spiritual, which is again causing a dilemma. It's finding the balance, and as you probably know, and from a Tai Chi perspective, balance is never static. It's in constant motion. Just like with lasting peace, this idea that peace is a finish line. We're going to get to peace. And I talk about the pivot. I don't know if we want to get into war and peace. Let's do that. But I just want to, but just to finish, because that's a if you'd like to. But so I want to read quickly a quote by Gus Speth, the climate, the environmentalist, that was very inspiring to me. He says, "I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. And that's where I think this is our time. This is our time to redefine what spiritual means. That spiritual, on some level, as many of our spiritual teachers throughout history have taught us, is a devotion to sentient beings and to be of service. And that the time is now for all of us who had the privilege and luxury to spend decades in retreat centers and spiritual communities to say, I believe that the spirituality of the 21st century has to be, we have to give back. We have to take all of our learnings and all of our realizations and actualizations, all of our healing of our wounds, and to remember that's power within. We have to continue to ally with others who share common values and to recognize with 8 billion people on the planet, it's time to create systems that allow others to have that same privileged experience.
So given what you're saying about bringing in more of the spiritual balance and balancing it with the technological, what are your thoughts on AI?
It's a great question. I think it's another example of what we're saying is that it's up to us to shift internally. Do we just use AI for more technological advancement, or do we use it to actually create, with spiritual nourishment, to create a more equitable, healing, nonviolent world? Do we do it to heal the planet? Do we do it to create what a true human global heart should be? A healthy heart distributes resources and information and nourishment to all parts of the body. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't just say, and it doesn't hoard those resources for itself. It's just graciously pumping to all parts of the body without exception. And at the same time, it's gathering toxins and releasing the things that we no longer need. So in a sense, what if we could use AI? What if we can, this idea of, we are already fully wired for taking our, so this idea of a global heart, this idea of we are interdependent, we are interconnected, we never have not been that. If there's anything, it's that the only thing that's keeping us from that is our mental construct that we're separate, but we are always that. So we've created a technological system that is the embodiment and the manifestation of interconnectedness and interdependence. So we've done the good job of setting that up. Now we need to spark it with the power of the heart, to like the software in the hard drive to activate it so that the technological system is working for us with the right amount of spiritual nourishment to help us step into where we are evolving as a human species.
Beautiful. Noelle, do I have time for one more comment and question?
Sure do.
I think what we're talking about here is getting out of the head and into the heart, right? And allowing that to be a lot more of how we make our decisions and how we reflect back what's happening around us. This heart coherence is, like you were saying, it's good for our health, number one. And when we're in a healthier state of being, it's better for everyone, right? And I think we all know the power of when even small groups of people are in heart coherence. It's that moment when there's like a mystical sort of shift that occurs, and, understanding or forgiveness happens, or some sort of light bulb of awareness goes off. I guess my question around that, Joe, is a lot of times that we have practices that move us towards that, but that type of phenomenon is not something that we could just will to happen, right? It just kind of happens on its own accord. And so how do we get into that? How do we get to that point where we're in heart coherence and we drop into this deeper space of compassion.
Well, I think that the training is to be able to have that level of heart coherence and resonance, not in the safety of your home or just not just in the safety of your home or on your cushion, but when you're going to the supermarket and when you're at work and when you're engaging with other people, particularly people who hold different views. And that's a skill that many of us haven't learned, and that's an upgrade of our skill set. The purpose of that being is that another pivot is love thy stranger, is that we've got to break the pattern of either loved one and enemy, and understand that the pivot is that it's not just friend or foe, that there are more strangers on this planet than there are loved ones, in terms of our own immediate circle of people that we would consider loved ones and the people we would consider adversaries. And yet most of the media and most of our thoughts in this polarizing time is just caught up with that. Who do we ally with and who are our enemies, or who see it differently? And the pivot is to say, with 8 billion people on the planet, at least for myself, I know if I were to break it down in terms of numbers, there's certainly more than 7 billion people on this planet that go into my stranger category. So there's never a single moment in a day that I can't say to myself, there isn't a stranger that I can connect with. So I think that's a very practical thing we can do. What can we do to make an effort to connect with people we don't know? And that even if they hold different views, we don't have to get them to agree with us. We don't have to agree with them. But that what we can find, and this is really key, are people who are tired of the lack of civility, who are tired of the polarization, and that even though we may hold different views, we can ally from that place, that we are committed to a culture of civility in a fierce way. And that, to me, is what's going to shift it. It weakens the extremes and strengthens us, because so many people I meet around the world are saying, I am so tired of this, but I feel hopeless. I don't know what to do. And that's what you do, is start engaging with people you don't know, seek out people with different views, and find a way to at least ally on the fact that you want to remain civil and not be in this fight and these extremes. And then to understand that it's a constant moment to moment. Lasting peace there's no end result to lasting peace. Lasting peace is what emerges in each moment. And it starts, and the blueprint for it, the scaffolding for lasting peace, is the durability and the strength and of the individual, what I call the renewable you, that you are vital and joyful and resourceful, coupled with the strength and resilience of the interpersonal, the relationships. In other words, to create a system that is inclusive, you must have a system of holding each other accountable. And that's where the fierceness comes in. And that is the basis of that. And it's a constant moment to moment, because we are human beings and we're always going to fall into our old patterns. And how beautiful if we have people who have the courage to both fiercely and civilly reflect that back at us, and then clear it so we get back to right relationship. And if we are trained to do that, and I have companies that are doing that, it's like a joke they have. It's like when someone in the organization needs to confront the other, they said, I'm going to do a Joe on you. Sit down, I'm going to do a Joe on you. And it's a lighthearted way that they know, okay, I'm not going to like it. It's going to feel uncomfortable. And that the basic premise of the definition for me of a confrontation is any encounter that deepens relationship, brings individuals closer together, and empowers everyone involved. And that includes the messy conversation. So in a sense, if Gina or someone else, if I were to say, I'd like to have a respectful confrontation, or if someone does that to me, my first response is, thank you, because you're telling me I matter. And you're willing to go through this awful, uncomfortable process, which nobody really wants to go through, because you care about the integrity of our relationship. And that's the rewiring. That's the new way to do it. So I'd love to hear if other people have thoughts, or Gina, if you had anything else, or questions.
I just wanted to add that I hope everybody's enjoying this, because Joe, I feel like I've learned so much from you, and I actually find myself saying Joeisms, or, you know, my new acronym is my new meaning for WWJD. What would Joe do? Like, I find myself in situations where I literally think about like how you would handle this, or some of the tools that you talk about, and I give myself a moment to step back and engage with them, and it really makes a difference. And so just thank you for all of this that you're sharing tonight. I hope everyone's finding it helpful.
Well, this is just, you know, I'd like to talk for another couple hours, but I'm sure that's not going to go over. But maybe we could have a follow-up conversation. But this has been truly wonderful. You got me early on when you talked about unexamined assumptions, because I can remember, and I'm not going to admit how old I was, but I had many decades on me. And I took this training with Pachamama Alliance, pachamama.org. And through their course, one of the things was on unexamined assumptions. So I'm taking it, and so then the instructor said, well, does anybody here have an unexamined assumption they'd like to talk about? And so I just said, no, I don't think I have any. Mm-hmm. that instructor must have gone home and laughed and laughed. But anyway, throughout, it was a 4-hour course. So later on, I kept on thinking, what's she talking about? Unexamined assumptions. And so I kept on interrupting. Oh, I think I got another one. And so I would talk, bring up, yes, that is an unexamined assumption. But I'm getting ready to prepare this talk for International Day of Peace for our congregation. And I'm going to start out by talking about unexamined assumptions, because it's such a powerful conversation. Like, we're part of a UU, and there's so many different belief systems. And so I think I'm going to start out and say, according to A Course in Miracles, God didn't create this world. We assume that God created it. Or do we create it? And just introduce unexamined assumptions. I've heard so many different belief systems here, and I agree there's really one truth. I'm not saying I know what it is, but I'm trying to know myself, so I might find that. But I'm really so tickled that you brought up unexamined assumptions and critical thinking, which wasn't really in any curriculum I had all the way through a PhD. It's so anyway, I'm going to quit blabbing here, expressing my gratitude, but I'll open the floor here, and Laurie has her hand raised.
Noel, could I respond to that for a moment?
Oh, I'd love it.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that your unexamined assumption is that you had no unexamined assumptions. And we all have them. That's the courageous self-reflection, is when we catch ourselves. But this is critical, I think, because one of the fundamental things, another pivot is there are two questions to ask. Who is telling your story? And that's what's important in that, is that because I think of what we're seeing, what's playing out, the cause of what we're seeing play out is many people who believe that reality is according to what their church has told them, or their government, or their parents, or their peers, or their friends, and never taken the moment that they may not believe the same thing. So the first question is, who is telling your story? And I think more of us need to look at that, because I think many of us, whether we know it or not, are influenced by what media is sharing with us. Mm-hmm. And then the next question is, what is your story? And then I always say, whatever your story is, please make it a story of fierce hope, and make yourself the central figure, the heroic figure in that story. And that brings you right back to yourself and your own personal agency, and knowing that you can influence whatever's around you and be a catalyst for fierce hope.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for that. All right, we'll go to
Lori.
Yeah, go ahead.
This was really going over some, I would say, familiar territory for me in my life, even starting very early on with having an Eastern teacher empath for 5 years, so having that exposure to the term oneness, and that continued on with a Western teacher for 30 years who wrote a book called Oneness, Our Heritage, Our Path, Our Legacy. And so basically, this individual, Bill Bauman, he embodied the most respectful communication of anyone I've ever known. His speech was so embracing, was that people would go, they would come to him and say, "This person sees me for my very first time in my whole life." That such utter acceptance, and just his speech was so loving. So he kind of modeled that for me. And then in my own path, then in these work situations, I came across something called toxic competitive rivalry. I don't know if anyone else has. And so, dodging arrows and doing some Aikido, and having you're carrying the ball with like a grant project, and people are trying to trip you up to make you look bad. It's like so I developed, or I collected a toolkit, like quiver with arrows, with practices that I shared last year with Noel and World Unity Week on civilized assertiveness. So that's a different term than civil confrontation, but it's a woman's work, Judith McClure, or how to navigate upset, or looking at emotional intelligence. And within those, it just creates this looking at the amygdala of like, why do people have a superheated overreaction in response to a perceived attack or threat? And then, okay, so then self-regulation and self-awareness to say, okay, I'm doing it again, so let me just pause, slow down, step away, just say, yeah, I'm not going to respond so as my best self, so let me just, we'll just table this and we'll come back to it. So, and one term that came up for me when you were talking was the term like global citizen, of 8 billion people not being like us and being all different. It's like, yay, they're different. Let's go explore this difference. It's really fun. They have different food, and they, and you can learn their languages, and you can. So that's a persona that I kind of have adopted. My email is planetary citizen, and that's one of the talks I did with that Peace Hour show was doing acceptance along the lines of different cultures, different races, different religions, along the lines of the Center for Partnership Studies, calling out hierarchy and patriarchy. So anyway, that's kind of like how I, resonate with all what you were sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Wow, Lori, I can feel your passion. It's tremendous. It's radiance. I can feel your passion for this work. So thank you, and thank you for all that you've done, and your teachers. It's an honor to be here with you.
Likewise.
Thank you, Lori. And Flo, did you want to join the conversation?
Yes, I really enjoyed this talk tonight, and I have found, I'm going to be 70 this year, and I've learned more in the past 10 years, I think, than I did in the previous 60. And I keep learning, and I'm so grateful for all of these tools that I can put in my tool chest to use. I recently finished a course in nonviolent communication, and I'm sure all of you have done something like that too. And it really has helped me a lot to stop and think about what I'm going to say to somebody and how I'm going to say it so that maybe they can accept it and have a conversation rather than a confrontation. So when you talk about this respectful confrontation, I appreciate that, because I've always been somebody who kind of, tries to stay away from confrontation. It's not enjoyable, right? But we do need it at certain times. And the other thing I wanted to say, there was something that you had said that really struck me, and I have to look at the chat to see if it's on there. I lost it, but at any rate, I really enjoyed this, and I will look at it again. And I'm still learning how to deal with people better and accept where they're coming from, even if it's not where I'm coming from, because we probably have some places that we're going to meet. And so if you can meet with somebody at some place, that opens up the room for them to say, well, maybe she's right about something else, or maybe it's not about right or wrong, it's just another idea. And I like to keep that. I like to keep, I'll hear something from somebody who I didn't think that I was going to, like what they were going to say, because I was assuming I knew what they were going to say. And then I say, yeah, that really makes a lot of sense. So, yeah.
I love that flow. I love that flow. If I can offer a couple of perspectives on that. So for me, I choose to be in the world in the sense of like working with organizations and conflict zones and all of that. And I think that that's important, and that with not high expectations that people are going to have big epiphanies or transformations. And I'll give an example that I've been doing trainings for NASA for about 12 years. And I'll do trainings. I have many groups. And at the end of every training, I'll ask, what are you going to take away? What did you take away from this? What's on your heart? What did you learn? And the number one thing that I heard over all the years that people said was, I never considered that the problem I'm having with my colleague, that I contributed to some of that problem.
Wow.
And for me, that's huge. Like that, they may never develop any further spiritually or with these concepts, but the fact that they got that is so deeply satisfying for me, because that's going to transform how they start looking at themselves and others. That's going to seep out to their relatives and their children and the people and their friends around them. And that's how we can really see that we can have a large impact in very small ways. And I'm so grateful that you're on that path of this idea of how can you feel more safe and skillful in the uncomfortable conversations. And one thing I would offer to you is that here are some of the pivots from the Fierce Civility book. One way to overcome the false polarity of I'm right, and therefore if you have a different viewpoint, you're wrong. The pivot for that is, do I want to be right or do I want to be effective?
Yeah, I agree with that. I really agree with that. And because it's not just all about you, and if you want to have a conversation with somebody that's going to make sense and be impactful for both of you, you have to be willing to see that they have something valuable to say.
Yeah. And what is your ultimate goal of this conversation? Is it to just be right, or do you want to be effective to come up with some healing or resolution or reconciliation or a new solution?
Perfect timing on this, Joe. Thank you very much.
I know you're buying the book. You haven't bought it already.
Yes.
I just want to ask another question about listening. Sometimes I feel that people just want to be heard. And that contributes a lot. I find myself listening a lot. One time, Bob said, why do people always talk to you? I go, I don't know. I just listen, and they like to be heard. And I think that really helps. And if nothing else, it's given you a little tune, a little vision into their perceptual problem. I think we all have a perceptual problem where we think everyone sees the world like I see the world. And so anyway, I was just wondering about the role of listening in fierce civility?
First of all, thank you for that. And I sense that about you, that that strangers will come up to you and tell you their life story. I'm sure that that's what happens. Um, and thank you for that, because it's of the utmost importance in the fierce civility methodology is cultivating a deeper level of listening. And that's why the training is almost like a martial arts and sports training, where you learn to rewire your system. And the image that I would use for that is like, imagine seeing your dialogue when you're dialoguing like tennis. That one of the pivots to break this idea, because many of us get stuck in this false polarity of aggression or passivity, and that we think and you may think it also causes a stagnation. And the way to break through that is to shift aggression to assertiveness. It's a different energetic, because when you shift aggression to assertiveness, there's an inherent listening, there's an inherent openness to it. And to shift passivity into receptivity, if you think about the energetic of that, am I checked out and not really engaged, or am I being receptive, which means I'm engaged? So that in the training is to train to cultivate assertive receptivity and receptive assertiveness. And that's almost like the infinity, the symbol. I
love that.
And that is basically how you would say tennis players learn to play. When you're asserting, you still have to keep the ball within a certain boundary, right? There's still control to what you're asserting. And when you're receiving, there's an alertness and an aliveness. And in essence, that is the essence of the work, is to be radically present in relationship with the other, listening to the subtle signals, because you've broken through a lot of the polarizations and unexamined assumptions. You're using independent critical thinking, you're meeting people where they are, and then you're in a dance.
I love that, and I love that visual. That's just
that's the idea, is to be in the dance of life. And that's another thing. What can you do today or tomorrow to contribute to a world of lasting peace? One thing I would say is get the earbuds out of your ears and don't look at your devices. And if you're in an urban place or whatever, connect with people. If you're you don't have to have long conversations, but just acknowledge that a human being is passing you on the street. And to just listen, because the number one way to help people out of their trauma response is to help activate the most basic human need, which is connection. So by just what you're doing, Noelle, is you're just helping people feel, I'm not alone, I'm connected. That could shift their lives. That could pull them out of a depression. Who knows what that's, and another thing I always say is, if you think of someone in your heart intuitively, send them a text, even just with a heart, because you never know what that, especially if you're more heart engaged and intuitive, you never know what that could pull them out of. Just to remember that they're loved and they're not alone. There's so many subtle, simple ways, and all of those small things accumulate. And that is the practice of lasting peace. Those small moment-to-moment daily things that you're doing to create deeper levels of engagement and connection, and overcoming deeper levels of separation and opposition.
Beautiful. That just reminds me of the work of Audrey Kitagawa with the Parliament of World's Religion. She did a whole special on the epidemic of isolation, and especially in the youth. And one thing is that we're at the tech. I saw riding on a bus today, and I was just kind of looking around. I've never really ridden a bus in this big city before, and how many people were so engaged, even up holding things up to their face, and I was having a hard time even saying hello, but I do want to see if Darcy, who I met through Veterans for Peace, we had a peace march in Washington, D.C., I didn't know whether you wanted to jump in here. We're about out of time, but if you want to say hello or a quick question, I invite you to unmute.
Hello, beautiful Darcy. Darcy's a dear, dear friend.
Oh, great. Okay.
Unmute. My friend Joe, okay, everything that he shared with you tonight, he lives. And it is that living presence of what he is and that he has put into his books. And by the way, you still have to sign the book I have of yours, okay?
All right.
So he's been so busy lately, but he came to me as the universe is so lovingly does for us, is he came to me at the right moment in my life where this man would just sit and listen and let me talk through the trauma that was needing to be healed. And it was that safe space that he provided that was a vital and necessary part of my healing process. And Noelle, you gave that to me too when we met. You were that. We sat down on the ground and just talked. We just talked and you just let me talk. And so as a veteran that has trauma that is recognizable and needing to be reprogrammed, a different pathway created, the necessity sometimes takes a little time, and it takes that safe space person that Joe Weston is, Noelle is, that allowed simply the sharing to get vulnerable with you, that provided the healing in the listening. So thank you for living and walking your talk.
Thank you, Darcy.
Love you, Darcy.
If you don't know Darcy, you must. Darcy is a great gift to this planet.
Yes.
Great, a jewel in this planet.
And we got to march together.
Yes, we did.
Yes, we did. Oh, what a beautiful, beautiful evening. I just am so thankful to you, Joe and Gina, for what you co-created, what you helped